To unpack Qatar's evolving strategy and Washington's shifting calculus, we're joined by Ms. Ginger Chapman, the political analyst and lawyer from Washington, D.C., specializing in U.S. foreign policy and Middle East diplomacy. Ms. Chapman, thank you very much for joining us. Israel's strike on Qatar marked a dramatic escalation. What does this event reveal about the limits of Qatar's security model?
Well, first, Mr. Haney, thank you for having me today, and greetings to your viewers. And one thing that's important to remember is Qatar was not bombed once, but Qatar was actually bombed twice. First, they were bombed by Israel in order to block ongoing negotiations with Hamas. And then second, they were bombed by Iran. So Qatar, as part of its role as an international mediator, it's assuming a larger role in international relations. It's becoming solidified as a peacemaker. However, the risks for Qatar, as we've seen, are immense. And right now, Qatar is a hot spot. America's largest base in the Middle East is in Doha. And Qatar now has to walk or navigate a very fine line between political, diplomatic, economic, and military relationships in a rapidly changing landscape. One of the first things we saw after the bombing in Qatar was Saudi Arabia and Pakistan entered into a security agreement because it became apparent that the United States could not or may not be able to protect our Gulf Arab partners from Israel. And this is further complicated by the role of China. China is actively pursuing its Belt and Road initiatives in the Middle East. It's developing trade corridors and railroads for commerce. So China is assuming an increasing role and would very much like to have closer ties with Qatar, as well as closer ties with Pakistan. However, Washington is an obstacle to this because Washington would like to keep China at arm's length away from our ally Qatar and our growing relationships with Pakistan over mineral deals. So Washington is also navigating and trying to gain opportunities for America, our mineral deals, our energy requirements, the flow of oil and gas. All of this is complicating relationships. First of all, economics is the most important, and then militarily. And we see that Qatar is caught in a unique position. They are in a geopolitical hinge area where many countries' interests, economic, military, and diplomatic interests, are coming together and centering on Qatar.
Well, Ms. Chapman, you've explained why maybe Washington would want to have stronger relations with Qatar, but despite the shocks you've already mentioned, Doha seems to be reaffirming its trust in Washington. So why is Qatar choosing deeper dependence instead of diversification?
Well, it appears that Washington is also seeking diversification, and Qatar appears to be seeking diversification, however, in a very diplomatic, nuanced way that does not threaten Washington, does not threaten America's concern over China as a rising power. So Doha, once again, Prime Minister Abdul Rahman, he has to walk a very fine line. He has very long-standing business and personal relationships with many high officials in Washington. Steve Witkoff. Trump has frequently spoken of his long-standing business relationships with Doha. So Doha is uniquely positioned, and it appears that as Washington, D.C. is also trying to diversify, Washington, D.C. is reaching out to Korea, Malaysia, Vietnam for mineral and economic relationships. And Doha, in a way, is going to play a large role in that. We see that Doha and Turkey are strengthening their relations, which in a way can also help the United States strengthen their relations with Turkey, because right now Trump knows he needs Turkey's
Hmm.
help with the situation in Palestine. However, Israel objects to Turkey. At the same time, so this is a very it's very dynamic, and the cross relationships are confusing. And
Yes, well,
Washington,
Miss Chapman, before we move on, you mentioned that Qatar is repositioning itself as an indispensable mediator. Now, how sustainable then is this personalized diplomacy model?
this is very sustainable. In fact, we say in America that Qatar is becoming the Switzerland of the Middle East. They have the means and the infrastructure to be well insulated from economic pressures, at the same time that they have good diplomatic relations with a variety of players that would be on opposing sides. So, for example, they are able to have negotiations with Saudi Arabia, with Pakistan, with China, and the United States is actually going to rely on Qatar more as Qatar develops relationships with nations that the United States does not have good relations. So instead of Qatar being shut out by increasing diplomatic relations with Pakistan and China, ultimately the United States will come to rely on Doha more, because they will have developing positive relations with countries that the United States will need to engage with. So even right now, as there are trade disputes between China, between Beijing and Washington, in the future, Qatar could also pave the way and negotiate better relations with
Yes.
China and Washington.
You mentioned Turkey. Now, Turkey remains a crucial partner in Doha's defense calculus. Yet, given Ankara's strained ties with Israel, is Turkey now an asset or a liability for Qatari security?
Turkey is going to be an asset, and this is not just because of their growing role in the Middle East, but also because they are a NATO country. So they have one foot in Europe, one foot in the Middle East, and this is going to enable them to perhaps bridge some of the gaps between what the United Nations objectives are in Palestine and the Middle East, and the resistance from Israel, and even their tenuous but increasingly positive relations with nations such as Qatar and perhaps eventually other Gulf states. And we do see President Erdogan is attaining a larger role, not just, for example, in negotiations between Ukraine and Russia and between NATO and Russia, but Turkey is also stepping up as far as having a louder voice in the international stabilization force that should be deployed in Palestine. Turkey is, or President Erdogan is making offers of assistance that is going to be very difficult for Washington to say no to, even in the face of Israeli resistance, as Turkey looks like a more responsible and a more engaged and a more diplomatic partner that will help President Trump in the Middle East.
Hmm.
Once again, President Trump's strategy in the Middle East is chaotic. He's very reactive to changing events, and President Trump does not have the political will to say no to Netanyahu. So Trump is increasingly relying on other nations to create an architecture or an infrastructure to help contain Israel's aggression in areas that the United States cannot say no. And a significant part of this is going to be the civilian military complex, the base that the United States has already established in Israel. President Trump announced yesterday the plans for a $500 billion new military base in Gaza. This is very confusing to the American people because J.D. Vance said American boots will not be on the ground. However, this new base is expected to hold up to 10,000 soldiers, not just Americans, but international soldiers. And Turkey is going to play a very large part in that. And Doha is going to have to be the country that is Trump's ambassador and helps Trump negotiate through these thorny issues that are essentially caused by the logjam that's happening now in Israel, in Palestine.
Talking about Qatar's partners, how do Qatar's overtures to the UK and France fit into this long-term security framework? Are these partnerships symbolic, or do they actually offer real protection?
Well, so far these partnerships have been viewed as symbolic. However, as the European Union, especially the E3, France, UK, and Germany, as they're becoming politically weaker at home because of their ongoing involvement in the Ukraine war, their populations are increasingly angry with them. Their economies are increasingly fragile as they're giving up cheap Russian energy. So the EU nations are going to actually rely more on Qatar, Doha's negotiations, and on the Middle East itself as a replacement for their energy needs, and also because as they're diplomatically losing ground on the international stage, their losses in Ukraine, they are going to have to pivot more to the Middle East, and Doha, their relationship with Qatar, is going to help the European Union perhaps far more than the European Union and the E3 will help Doha. But this will lead to Doha's increasingly positive reputation and the reliance of the E3 countries as well.
One final question, Ms. Chapman. Washington's pressure on Gulf states regarding China is intensifying. So how does Qatar balance its economic ties with Beijing while avoiding strategic friction with the U.S.?
Yes, and this is exactly the needle that Doha must thread. There is increasing involvement with China amongst all nations because of China's Belt and Road Initiative, and more countries are engaging in positive economic relations with China, even in defiance against America. We see this happening in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So as the United States increasingly relies on our international partners, as the world becomes more multipolar and the United States has to accept living in a multipolar world, Doha will have less resistance from Washington in their relations with China, especially as their economic as opposed to military relations. And Doha will wind up becoming a bridge between China and the United States relation-wise, even though initially Doha is going to have to tread lightly and thread the needle in their initial relations with China. But ultimately, as Doha-Beijing relations improve, then Washington will benefit by having Doha assist Washington with China relations.
Ms. Ginger Chapman, thank you very much for joining us from Washington. Always a pleasure.